Hello, I'm Barrington Barber. I'm going to show you how to learn to draw. You've done harder things in your life already. You've learnt how to walk and talk and read and write, which are much harder than drawing. And with a series of simple exercises and plenty of practice, you will soon be able to draw almost anything you want quite competently and enjoy it. So we'll start now with a series of very simple exercises of getting marks on paper. Well, the first thing is to get your attention onto where your pencil actually meets the paper and then make a mark. And now the easiest kind of mark is a sort of fairly straight line. But watch the pencil mark come off the end of the pencil. Then try it in a different direction, say a horizontal, like that. And then try it in two other directions, angled one way and angled the other way. And all the time, keep your attention on the point of the pencil as you draw. The next marks are going to be very similar, but you're introducing a little more control. Not only are you drawing straight lines, you're trying to draw them all the same length and all the same distance apart. And what you'll notice, as you keep your attention on the pencil, as you draw the marks on the paper, sometimes the marks come out beautifully straight and sometimes you get a wobble. Every time you get a wobble is when your attention has slightly slackened off. So you can tell exactly how much your attention is working, which is quite interesting. So having had a go at doing them vertically, you might try something a bit more difficult where you try doing them diagonally. Only the diagonal lines, of course, are all different lengths and the distances apart are harder to judge. So you're giving yourself a much harder task here, although it's still really a very simple exercise. You're only drawing lines. It doesn't really matter if you get them wrong, but you attempt to get them as accurate as you possibly can under the circumstances. But keep the attention on the point of the pencil, especially the feel of it. The next shapes are slightly different because we're drawing circles now. And a circle you can envisage in your mind as a perfect circle, but trying to draw it is a different matter. So you've got to keep the thing moving round and curving all the time, and you try and make the curve as evenly as possible, and you have to end up in the same place as you started. Another way of trying it is to try a spiral, where you take the curve round and you're gradually, all the time, going slightly inward and slightly inward and slightly inward. And what you notice here is that very soon the smoothness and balance disappears very quickly. Now we're moving into a conceptual area where we're going to show you how to draw apparent three dimensions. You can't really draw three dimensions. All you can draw is a set of conventions which convince the eye that it means to be three-dimensional. I'm going to draw a cube, and I've started by drawing this strange diamond, flattened diamond shape, and then taking straight lines down in parallel, the same length. I create the sides of the cube, and then just joining up the last two bits, I create something that gives the impression of a three-dimensional cube. Now, to take it even further, I can add a certain amount of tone to it. And the way to do it is you take the tone over the whole of two sides, say, like that. You have to assume that the light is coming from the top. I now add a bit more tone to this side because this one is in deeper shadow than that one. So you've got the tone building up on the second side, which helps to create even more feeling of dimension. And just to help that along a bit, I'm now putting in a shadow shooting out from it on the ground that it's standing on. It's not actually standing on anything. None of these things are real. It's just a set of conventions that give the eye the idea that this is three-dimensional. and the light is coming from here and is casting a shadow over here. And this is a similar exercise. Taking a sphere, what happens here, I'm going to have the light coming from this corner, and so all round this area you'll have a tone covering slightly more than half of the sphere. Having got the shading on like that, I'll now need to build it up a bit, because when you have a sphere, the shadow round the edge is much deeper than the shadow across towards where the light is shining. And you don't take it right to the edge though, because the darkest part, because there's a certain amount of light flooding round the curve of the sphere, the darkest part is just inside the edge of the circle. Now, the only part where it does tend to touch the edge is where the sphere is apparently resting on the ground, which is where the shadow will come from that is cast by this sphere on the ground. So once again, you've got this feeling of something that is three-dimensional, and you can build up the tone here, especially on the darker part, because the more intense the darkest part gets, the more it begins to look like a three-dimensional object. You will probably also have to darken up the edge just at the bottom there too, which also helps to give the impression. Now we move on from an imaginary sphere to a real spherical object like an apple. And looking at this apple, you first of all have to sort of get some idea of the basic shape of the apple. It's not quite a regular sphere, any more than probably your first drawing of the sphere was anyway. You try to work out how the shape works, and it has a sort of slightly elongated shape here, and you'll notice that it has an indentation at the top where the little stalk comes out like that, and the light is again coming from the top right hand. Now when you put the toning in this time, go round the curve of the apple, because it helps to describe the way the skin of the apple works, particularly where the colour is. And you get more of an idea of how an apple looks when you do that. Don't forget that you'll have a little bit of shadow in there with where the hollow is, and you'll get some areas where it's much, much brighter. But there's quite a lot of tone on this. In order to make the bright bits look brighter, you have to put in slightly more tone than you did on the ordinary sphere. Start by getting a tone over the whole of the area where you think there's tone. Follow the line of the apple round all the time at this stage as well. Later on you can vary your strokes, because when you build up the tone, you do need to vary them. Now, having now got the whole thing there, you can see that there's a shadow coming off this apple that goes out across like something like that. Again, keep the same tone to start with. And you'll notice that this shadow has relatively sharp edges near the apple and softer edges away from the apple, where the light gets in a bit. Now, start putting in the darker tones. You've got darker tones around here, and you need to put those dark tones in quite strongly, because there's a little reflection on that side as well. It's not as bright as on the brighter side, but there's still a reflection there, and you want to show that. Some parts are very dark, like along the edge there, it's particularly dark. Seems to be an accumulation of tone there. And you've got a very sharp, hard edge down this edge, particularly just there before it gets to the shadow. Then where the shadow comes, it sort of disappears into the shadow a bit, but you get a very dark piece under the bottom, round that part of the shadow, and then that part is very dark indeed. And then you get a sort of umbra and penumbra, so you've got two shadows, one within another on the cast shadow, which is always happens with artificial light. You can build this up a bit more because it helps to make the light look even lighter. Again, you've got a sharp edge there which stands out against a slightly darker background. And this is one of the things you can do when you're drawing, is to note the background you're against. The background here is quite bright in relation to the apple, but around here there's a bit of tone going across the background which will then again emphasize the light area here, make it look even lighter. So you can put the background tone in as well if you want to. But in the first shot, if you don't get that far, don't worry. The next thing we're going to draw is a glass, but before we do that, we'll have to show you how to draw an ellipse, because this shape, an ellipse, is like a circle seen from an oblique angle, and it has quite a specific shape. There are no neat or mechanical ways to draw an ellipse, unfortunately. Artists have tried for hundreds of years to find better ways of drawing ellipses mechanically, but there's very few of them. Most of them are so complicated they're not worth trying. But you have to draw a shape that is like that. It's rather like a flattened circle, if you like. But it must be a curve all the way around. It mustn't have points at the end. It mustn't go flat anywhere. To give you some idea of how it works, you have one axis, a long axis, and a short axis. The short axis, and they're exactly perpendicular to each other. So you now know that each quarter of this ellipse has to be exactly the same as all the other quarters except mirror fashion. So that shape there is really the same as that shape there, and this shape here is the same as that shape there. And ideally, all that space in between should be exactly the shape. You should almost be able to fold it over and show that it is the same. So now we're going to come and draw the actual glass itself. And to start with, it's quite a good idea to get some idea of that top ellipse, that top edge of the glass, and to try and draw it as accurately as you can. And make sure it's not too wide across the short axis and doesn't have pointed ends across the long axis. Then when you've got that in, then you follow down and follow through the two sides. Now, these sides again are mirror images of each other. Whether the glass is a curved glass or a straight glass, ideally the sides will always be like a mirror image of each other away from the central line of the glass. Then the bottom ellipse is slightly different because it's a smaller ellipse to start with, because it's a smaller circle, but it's also a deeper ellipse because you're looking down on it more, so you actually see more of the width across that way. And the nice thing about drawing a glass is that you can see through it, so all you can really draw are the edges. But as you're looking at the glass, you will notice there are some very dark areas where the shadows get in, and then some very bright areas. And it's quite a good idea to show this contrast. So when you put the dark areas in, don't hesitate to put them in quite darkly, because it will make the light areas look that much lighter and brighter, and it'll start looking more glassy if you do that. Notice there's a long sort of shadow down the side there. That edge seems to disappear a bit, but the top edge is quite bright. Now, in order to show that's bright, you're going to have to put some tone inside the shape of the glass and outside the glass. So you'll need a bit of tone across here like that, which gives you an idea of the brightness of that edge, and you'll need some tone outside as well to help that come across. So you're building up areas of tone around the glass which help to define the brightness and the darkness of the glass itself. You'll notice that that edge along the top is probably one of the brightest bits. particularly at a couple of points along it, and then you get one or two points on it which look quite dark, say just there for example. That edge looks quite dark, and this bit of the edge in there looks quite dark. Again, you need a little bit of tone coming down here so that the top of the glass shows up more clearly. And again, you've got a dark area and some bright areas in there, and there's one or two light areas in there, and again just take your tone down a little bit to help define. It's also got a shadow. Now you notice the shadow of the glass again is like the glass itself, you can see through it, so you've got a slightly less dense shadow coming across like that. I'll just put in a bit more of this tone just to balance the picture out. Now I'm going to draw a bottle, and to make it easier, again it's a glass thing, so it's basically the edges we're going to draw, but to make it easier I'm going to draw first of all a central line, and all the bottle will be either side of this central line, so you get the base of the bottle here somewhere and the top of the bottle here somewhere. Both will be ellipses. Then you've got the neck of the bottle, and you work out how the proportion of the neck works in relation to the proportion of the body of the bottle and the way that the shoulders of the bottle slope. So you're just sort of blocking it out and getting some idea of how it works together to make sure you get the shape right, so that it does look like the sort of bottle that you're drawing. Obviously, if nobody else sees the bottle, they won't know whether you've got it right or wrong exactly, but nevertheless, you try and get it as accurately as you can. But it's the very basic shape that you need to look at, rather than worrying about every detail. In this case, we won't be putting any tones in at all. We're just trying to make sure that the shape does work as a bottle shape. Sometimes it disappears against the background, so it's a bit difficult to see, and that's all right, just don't draw it so heavily. Make it slightly more difficult to see, because that will give you more of an idea of how the thing looks. Where you see it's very clearly marked, draw it more heavily. And what you'll notice that when you've done this drawing like this, you've got all the basis there of a complete bottle, but you haven't actually drawn very much. Well, now we come to a slightly more complex shape. This is a teapot, which, although isn't terribly complex, in fact, because it's got projections like the spout and the handle, it's going to make your life a little bit more difficult, but it's also more fun to draw, because the more complex the things you draw are, the more fun they are to try and get them right. That's one of the great things about drawing, is that you never at any stage achieve perfection. You're always trying again to get it even better and more accurate and better still. And it's one of the fun things about it, is that you never run short of work. You can go on drawing the rest of your life and still be learning. I've been drawing longer than most of you have been alive, and I'm still learning. So, first of all, you've got to get some idea of the proportions. Proportions of the handle and the lid to the main shape, and you're helped here in the shape by the stripes round the body of the pot, because they help to show the way the shape goes round. So you've got one large stripe round the top, like that, and you notice that you're sort of drawing ellipses all the time. Another one round the bottom of the lid, and then the blob on the top, of course, and then another one just above the spout, comes round like that, and then another one comes out from the spout, which I'll get to in a moment when I finish this one. Here it is. And notice now this one is a nice one. It's obviously a hand-painted pot, and it's slightly off-centre, so it's slightly wobbly the way it goes around. So you've got all those sort of things to look at when you're drawing. And that's why every drawing is always different, even if people are drawing the same things, because they see slightly different things each time. So your drawing will never look like somebody else's drawing, no matter how hard you try. Now you can see how now the shape is beginning to emerge. And now, again, notice how some of the edges are much stronger and clearly defined than some of the others. When you're drawing, point that out in your drawing. Make your drawing much stronger where the edge is clearly defined and much weaker where it's not so clearly defined, so that it slides a bit into the background. There's a bit under here because of the shadow being cast by the pot. Across here, that edge of the spout shows up more than the upper part of the spout. Now, putting in some tone to build up the dimensions. Again, you've got dark areas and light areas. A little sharp edge there. It goes down into the lower part of the pot. And yet there's a very bright bit down there, so you're going to have to leave that a little bit without tone on it. You can bring in a bit of rubber to get rid of some of those marks that you've put in as definition marks to start with. Notice the edge of the lip where the lid goes in is quite strongly defined, partly by the blue stripes and partly by the fact that it juts out. So it picks up the light and it has the colour to show the edge. And this bit, you're coming down here now, that part of the handle's very clear, that part's quite clear. This fades a bit into the background and is in fact in a tone. You've got to take that edge round there like that. So you've got a slight bit of light on the edge there. But that becomes a bit tonally like the background. You're going to have to put in some of the background as to help show the change of tone where the light hits the pot. But you don't have to put a lot in. There's quite a lot of shadow on the top part of the spout, and as it goes down away from the upper part of the spout, it appears to look slightly lighter. You've got a bit of the, again, the tones of the colour, which I'm going to put in, leaving gaps where you get bright reflections shining on them. Notice there's quite a strong shadow there. That's quite well defined down there. And of course all the lower half you can add more tone, and even the stripes don't stand out quite so strongly in that lower half. And then you've got your cast shadow. The thing about using cast shadow, it always works because it anchors the object onto the ground and it makes it look more stable and dimensional because of that. So it's always worth looking at the cast shadow of an object. This one, you've got a bit of spout sticking out as well, so it's quite an interesting mixed shape. I just put a bit more tone across there. So there's a version of the teapot which gives you some idea of how to produce a three-dimensional object. And now we come to drawing a group of objects which you have to approach in a slightly different way, because you have to take notice of all the objects as opposed to just one at a time. But to make it easy, you can start with, say, the central object, which is a bowl here, probably the widest and biggest object. That will help you to work out the proportions of everything else if you get that basically right to start with. So once you've got the feel of that proportion, then you can place in the other larger objects which are close to it and partly hidden by it. And this is one of the things about a group of objects, that they will create shapes against each other as they obscure parts of each other. And also what is very important, which mainly was what this exercise is about, is not only looking at the shapes of each object, but looking at the shapes between each object too. Most people who haven't practiced as artists, when they look at objects, they just see the object and they sort of isolate it in their mind from all the things around it. But in fact, when you're drawing, you have to actually draw the spaces between things as well as the actual objects themselves. And the spaces between are just as important because they help you to define the size and proportion of the actual shapes of the object. So you're never actually drawing gaps or spaces, because the spaces mean something. If you notice the space I'm drawing now, around the edge of this vase, and it comes down to where the melon is, and you get a shape going across between the melon and where it slightly obscures the orange, and the orange comes out of that. So you've got a whole shape in there which you can see as a shape, and that will help you to get the shapes of the other things around it correct. The shape between the bowl and the melon creates a particular kind of shape again. And as long as you get that curve of the bowl right, the shape in between the bowl and the melon can be seen quite clearly, and that helps you to define the bowl. So what you'll find is when you're beginning to draw on a larger scale, when you're drawing more than one thing at a time, you will find that these spaces between things are just as important, as far as the artist is concerned, as the things that they encompass. And you keep working your way backwards and forwards between the shapes of the objects and the spaces in between them. So when you're drawing like this, do take note of the spaces. Well, now we're going to do a group of objects. This is a bowl of fruit, and obviously the first thing you need to look at is the edge of the bowl, which is going to hold all the fruit together. Before you finish drawing the whole bowl, just have a look at how the pieces of fruit fit together into the bowl in a sort of fairly generalised way, so you get the feeling of them without drawing any sort of detail whatsoever. But you've got to make sure you've got a big enough shape for the apple, and the smaller lime behind it, and the orange sticking up and holding up the edges of the bananas. So you now got some idea of how the fruit's going to fit into that space. And then you've got the whole of the depth of the bowl to draw in, and you've got to make sure you get that right sort of curve. And again, you can do it quite sort of loosely to start with. All this can be drawn quite loosely. You've got a shadow which you're going to put in, working out across there. Now what we're going to do, as well as draw up in more detail, we're going to put in tone as well. So first of all, I'm going to define some of the shapes a little bit more. So I get the edge of those bananas where they join together and try and get the feel of them going round away from you in space. So you get each curve slightly different, curving up into the space behind, and then making sure the apple shape is the right sort of bumpy curve with the indentation where the stalk is, and then the small lime sticking out the top, and the orange sort of behind everything else. Now, the first thing you've got to do is to decide where the main areas of tone are, and it's quite easy to see that most of that dark on the inside, any parts of the inside of the bowl are mostly dark. You've got an area all round the lower part of the apple, which is quite dark. An area where there's shadow going across, cast across the top of the orange, and one side of the banana is quite dark in tone. So you've got quite large areas of tone on these bananas already. And as you can see, I'm still keeping the whole thing pretty loose. Now there's a very bright bit along the edge of this bowl, which I mustn't obscure, and if I do, then I have to bring a rubber in and rub it out afterwards. So I've got to try and keep that light area, because it's going to make the darker look more interesting against the brightness of the sharp edge. And the tone, which is not quite as dark as the bowl, but is fairly dark. So now I need to go further. First of all, go for the very dark bits. There's a very, very dark bit in there behind the edge of the apple and under the lime on the inside of the bowl, and that's really quite dark. And so you can put that in quite black. There's another dark piece here where the end of the bananas are, and in there's a very dark piece. In there, between the two bananas, is a very dark part. You've got a sharp edge along there, a very sharp edge along here. And it's the contrast between the very darks and the lights that are going to give this thing its feeling of dimension. Now, part of the bowl are very dark indeed. You've got a very dark area coming down here, and most of that side of the bowl is pretty dark. Quite a heavy tone. It curves away underneath so that the lower part's dark, but the upper part's much lighter. You can actually see a sort of pattern along the edge of the bowl as the bowl moves round there, which you can't see on the darkest part. Make sure that stalk is seeable. Now, as I'm finding my pencil's getting blunt, I move to a new one, which I've already sharpened, so I don't have to keep sharpening pencils all the time. The edge of that shows up a lot, and you can get quite a dark texture in there. A lot of dark tone round here, which will contrast with the very bright spot that appears on the top there. Notice where the edges, these sort of slightly browned edges of the bananas are, which help to define them quite well. This side is not so definite as the other side. It tends to be a bit softer edged. And don't forget, if you can't see very easily the division between an edge and the things next to it, draw it like that. Draw it so that you can't see it very clearly, because it will give more verisimilitude and will tend to look like the way you see things. Mostly people think they have to draw every detail sharply as possible, but you don't. A lot of it can be almost like a smear. And so you see a dimensional object built up out of tonal values. One big art school trick that art teachers play on art students is to test them as draftsmen and as painters by taking something very ordinary and making them look at it again, which is what I want you to have a shot at. The nice thing about this is when you look at the actual crumpled piece of paper, it's not quite as difficult as it may look at first. First of all, look at the main shapes. Again, you're not worrying about being too accurate on this. This is not a perfect specimen of something, and it's not something that when you finish drawing it, anybody's going to recognise as anything except a crumpled piece of paper. Now, when you've actually finished drawing it, of course you can throw the crumpled piece of paper away, and all people will have is your drawing. So it must be right, mustn't it? Whatever you come up with. Of course, for your own sake, you do make an effort to draw it as accurately as you can, because what you're trying to do is you're learning how to draw accurately. And the interesting thing about this is that it's all odd bits and pieces, and you've got to try and get it so that it makes some sort of sense in terms of dimension. And the only way you're going to do that is with the tones. So first of all, get the main shapes as near as you can get them, without worrying too much if they're not quite right. When you've done that, which I've almost done, you then need to look at the tonal areas. Now, you can see immediately which bits are very bright. So those pieces you're going to leave completely. But over the whole of the rest, you can put a tone. Which is what I'm proceeding to do. Now, it can be a light tone to start with, because being white paper, it doesn't have very dark tones on it, although there are one or two places where it looks dark. But first of all, put all the tonal areas in about the same depth or tonal value. You get these very shallow troughs where the tone is only just noticeable. So you don't want to start off making the tone too heavy. And the funny thing about paper is it crumples in a particular way that no other material does. I suppose the nearest thing that can crumple like it is thin metal. Now, I'm going to put a cast shadow in, because the cast shadows, oddly enough, are the rather darker parts, and it does help to define some of the edges a bit. So all the edges at the bottom that are up against the cast shadow are nice and clearly seen against the darkness of the cast shadow. So it helps to place your area of paper in space, I suppose. Okay, now the darker areas on the paper itself. And these deeper sort of ravines in the paper give you the darkest shadows. So you can strengthen them quite a bit. If you're going to be very accurate about this, you can take a long time making the tonal changes subtler and subtler and subtler. I'm not doing this here because it would take too much of the whole exercise, and you would have got bored by the time I had finished it. Again, notice that some of the edges of the paper are much more sharply defined than some of the others. And make sure they are on your drawing too. Now, I think this is probably getting to the point where it's enough to give a fairly good impression of a crumpled piece of paper, so I won't take it very much further now. But when you're doing it yourself, take it as far as you want to, and if you get very interested in it, and you can get a little bit obsessive about art, there's nothing wrong with that. It's quite good for artists to be a little bit obsessive. And you want to take it further and further and further, go ahead and do it until you get bored and then stop. Now we're coming to a plant, a little sprig of a blossom, and the main thing about drawing this is, to start with, don't try and get too precise about it. Try and draw the way it grows. For example, the stalk comes up like this and sort of curves over, and then on the end of it you've got a sort of blossom here. And there's another stalk coming across here with lots of little buds on it, and then one coming round here with another beginning to open blossom. And then you've got leaves growing off it at different angles. And try and get the feel of the way the leaves grow off from the stalk. In a way, that's more important than getting every leaf perfect. The way that they grow off and the curves they make tend to make the thing look as though it's alive more. Now, once you've got the feel of all that, it's all moving up nicely, you can then, look in more detail, and you can notice that you've got these rippled edges of the blossom and the little stamens in the middle coming out, and you can see the edge of one of the petals there, and another one shooting out there, and another one coming up this way. So you're beginning to build the actual flower, and then you notice that there's a certain thickness to this stalk, which obviously gets thicker as it goes down, which you have to make sure that happens. And then each curve of each leaf is going to have a certain kind of look to it, where you've got little buds there, little sort of stumpy ends to the stalks, one that curves round. You can see the edges of some of the petals, but they're not open yet. And then underneath that, there's a leaf going across there, and it's got little wrinkled bits on it. And the leaf coming up here is a sort of slight wobbly one side and much smoother the other side as it comes out. The one coming up behind it, behind the stalk, does something like that. And the one coming out from this side does a sort of bend over, curve, and then another one coming up behind that, so it almost appears to be going behind it. And the one coming this way does a sort of twist towards you as it curves round. And all these movements that you're trying to get in will keep the thing looking as though it's alive. You can get too rigid with plants, and you don't have to be so totally accurate. The feeling of the shape and the way it curves is much more important than total photographic accuracy. You can end up making a plant look quite dead if you're too accurate. But as long as you keep the feel of the way it moves, it's not so difficult. And then you can put some tone in. For example, some of these leaves, one half is in much deeper shadow than the other half, which tells you, when you look at it in the picture, that it's one leaf is curving up, cutting off the light, while the other one's facing the light. And all those little changes of tone are quite useful, because they give you some idea of which way the leaves are facing. But again, don't worry about being too accurate. One of the nice things about plants, and you'll notice this when you're actually drawing them, when you've got a plant in front of you drawing it, the plant actually moves all the time. It doesn't stay still. And so by the time you've drawn one leaf and you come on to the next, that leaf has changed slightly. And if you go back to another leaf, you find it's changed again. So you don't have to worry too much about this sort of accurate perfection. The feel and the movement of the growth is far more important, and you'll end up with a thing looking much more like a plant and less like something that's been carved out of stone. Like that. We've come outside now to have a look at some drawing from nature, and I'm going to now have a go at drawing the tree here, which give you some idea of how to approach this sort of size of drawing. First of all, what you'll notice I'll do is I block in the main area of the tree. I'm not worried too much about any of the leaves or bunches of leaves even. I'm looking at the whole bulk of the tree and the way it hangs and the branches spread out. The main part of the trunk is coming down the centre here and is growing out of the lawn here. So you've got the bulk of the trunk and then these large areas of leaves which are hanging down around the main part of the tree. Now, quite a lot of the leaves are hanging down in the front of the tree, and you have to differentiate those from the ones further back, which will be much more in shadow. The area behind the trunk here will tend to be darker, so you can start blocking in areas of tone quite loosely like that. Don't worry about the fact that you may be covering up holes in the trees. Just block it in main shape, really. Now, you've got a few holes under here, so you don't want to block all that in. This area here is quite dark in relation to the sky against which you're seeing it, and you can start now putting in a bit more of the detail. Notice some branches come out towards you and some cut across and are silhouetted against the background. Now I'm darkening up the top part of the trunk, and there's a big branch that shoots out from the trunk here and it goes off into the tree somewhere like that, and another branch seems to be hanging down across here. The leaves here are quite dark, so I can darken all this up a bit. I've got to define the edge of the tree a bit. And you use a sort of, it's almost like a scribble technique of bulking out areas of leaves, but not worrying too much about details. The only bits that you notice clearly are the edges of the leaves, where the edges of the tree appear to be. And there you can mark them, that's a little bit more obviously as bunches of leaves. But you don't need to get too caught up in any of the detail. Keep it simple. This area is quite dark around here. There's some sort of branch coming out there. There's a place where a branch has been lopped off at some time. You've got the shape of the trunk coming down like this. And there's a lot of striation marks where the tree's growing, just to give some idea of the bark of the tree. But you notice I'm keeping the whole thing relatively simple. I'm not trying to get into any sort of detail whatsoever. You can define part of the ground underneath the tree because there's always a shadow under a tree. The defining point of the leaves that are catching the light is the edge against the darker leaves, and that's quite important because it defines the bulk of the tree a little bit more obviously. You notice on these upper parts, because the light catches quite a lot of it, I'm putting much less tonal value in. I'm producing a sort of texture, leafy looking texture, which gives you some of the feel of the tree without worrying too much about each leaf. Change a pencil here. Always have a couple of pencils ready, sharpened at least, because you don't have to start sharpening pencils in the middle of your drawing, so you can just swap pencils at the critical moment. Now obviously in quite a fast drawing like this, you're not going to get every quality of the tree exactly right. It's the general appearance you're working on here. And of course, even when you're doing a more detailed version of a tree, it's the general appearance, first of all, that gives you the look and quality of the tree. And that is more important than all the detail. The details help afterwards to drive home the quality of the tree, but if those first impressions don't work, then the rest, the detail won't help. Darken up some of this in the background a bit in comparison. Make sure that edge of the tree looks slightly darker, it's more silhouetted. Bit more darkness in there. More in there. And a bit more up there. And there you have an impression of a tree. Well, drawing the human body is the hardest thing you'll ever learn to draw. And one of the ways to ease your way into it is to use every possible trick you can to help do it. I'm now going to draw my own hand. And first of all, I place my hand on the paper. And just to make sure that I've got a good idea of what a hand looks like, I'm going to trace round the outside edge of my hand. Now you have to be a little bit careful of this, because it's very easy to make the tracing either vastly bigger than your hand or even smaller because you dip the pencil in underneath the fingers and things like this. So you have to be a little bit careful not to exaggerate it too much and try and get it as near as possible a direct trace of that shape of your hand. Now this isn't going to be the drawing of your hand, but it's something to refer to when you come to draw the hand from life. So you've got something, you already know roughly how long the fingers are, what the width of the hand is in relation to its length. So when you look at your hand and start to draw it, you can see that you've already got quite a lot of information. So you may start drawing your hand and putting in the shapes, and you realise that finger goes out there like that, which is rather like that one there. And of course you see it slightly differently each time you look at it, so it won't be exactly the same, but it helps to correct any vast disproportions that you might bring into the drawing if you hadn't already done that first. So it's quite a useful trick to know. Unfortunately, you can't do it with very many parts of the body, the hand being the obvious one, but then the hands are difficult to draw. So anything that makes it easier is going to be good. One of the things you'll learn as an artist, there's no such thing as cheating. All art is a cheat. It's an illusion. You're creating an illusion, and any way that makes it easier for you to do it is valid. Now, you will get different effects by doing that, but nevertheless, finally, when it comes down to it, what you're trying to do is to convince somebody that what you've drawn actually means something. Now, I've obviously drawn this thumb a little bit too small. When I look at the other one, it should be a bit bigger than that. And then I can put in things like the shapes of the nails, which of course I didn't do in the previous one. And that helps me to sort of define the ends of the fingers. And then I can put marks in where the wrinkles on the knuckles are, where the skin gets folded over. Of course, on my hand, because it's a fairly antique one, the wrinkles show up much more easily. And things like the veins on the back of the hand show up much better. Put in the knuckles on the back of the hand. And then the line of the bone structure that shows under the skin. And then you can even put some tonal areas in. For example, this area, from where I'm drawing it, seems to be much more in shadow than the rest of the hand. But I put the nail in there to make sure it's all right. And a lot of the side of the hand is in shadow up here. And then the knuckles always create a slight shadow because they stick up from the back of the hand. Anything that sticks out will cast some sort of shadow somewhere. So it's all, every shadow you put down sort of indicates something sticking out from the rest of the shape. Then you can even do things like I'm putting a few hairs on the back of the hand and a feeling of the veins going through the back of the hand. And just generally getting a feel of what the hand looks like. But it's all made much easier because I'd already drawn this outline. And I can keep referring back to it. While I'm drawing this, I can keep looking back at that and thinking, yes, is it like that? Or yes, it's a bit like that. It could be a bit more like this, it could be a bit fatter or thinner, etc. And finally, when you're correcting drawings, that's all you're doing. You're either making a line longer or shorter or fatter or thinner or rounder or straighter. So there's no great deal in it. It's just common sense, really. Now we come to the proportions of the head. The first form here is the shape of the head as a whole, and it's about 1.5 times the length as to the width at the widest point. The widest point is just above the ears. Taking that form and dividing it down the centre so that you get the full face balanced either side of a central line. The eye level, most important to get the eye level right, full face, the eye level is exactly halfway down the head. The end of the nose is about halfway between the eye level and the chin, and the mouth comes slightly closer to the nose than it is to the chin. The eyes themselves, the length of the eye is the same as the distance between the two eyes. Those sort of things help you to get the proportions right. The lobe of the ear comes level with the bottom of the nose, and the tops of the ears probably come up somewhere near the eyebrow mark. If you look at the profile view, the shape changes a bit. You've got a square shape. The height of the head and the width of the head is more or less the same, except the nose projects beyond it. All the other measurements are similar to the full face. The hairline, there's a diagonal across the square, and the hairline, although it meanders across that line a little, is mostly to the left-hand side. When you're drawing the head, the optimum position for a drawing is what's called a three-quarter view, so that you don't just get the both the eyes, but you get the shape of the nose as well. If you have the face full on, you don't get so easily shown the shape of the nose. And if you have a profile which shows you the shape of the nose, you can only see one eye. So this three-quarters view is usually the preferred position of a portrait. It's not the only one, but it's mostly what artists do. Now, the first thing is to basically get the feel of the shape of the head. So you've got some idea of the length of the head and the way it sits on the neck. If you notice that at this stage my drawing is very light, very loose, and there's not a great deal of detail at all. So I'm just building up the feel of the way the head sits on the neck and the proportions. And then you've got the nose, giving you halfway in the distance between, and then the mouth, which is slightly close to the nose and is the chin. The light is coming from the right-hand side, so you've got strong light on the right-hand side of the head and a shadow across the rest of the face. Now, in order to make this work, it's probably a good idea at this stage to put in the first area of shadow. It still allows you to draw over the top, and as you can see, I'm using a Sanguine Conte pencil, which gives a softer, more sympathetic mark, and drawing in this medium is creates a slightly more sympathetic look to the portrait. Now, one thing you've got to be sure of is the way the shadow comes down the edge of the nose. So you don't have too much, too strong a shadow, but although it is going to be one of the strongest shadows. Now you've, around the mouth, you notice how the light catches the top lip a little and the bottom lip quite a lot. So the shadow under the bottom lip and the rest of the mouth is in shadow. I'm taking the tone across the face and down to the chin now. The chin has shadow coming across it a little way in order to get the sort of rounded effect of the chin. And then on the neck you get the shadow cast by the chin across the front part of the neck, and so all the side of the neck again is in shadow. Just to indicate where the neckline is to give you a sort of positional shape for the neck. Now I'm going to look rather more carefully at the outline edge on the right-hand side, which is very sharply delineated because of the light falling on it. So I've got to make sure that that works, and I can't afford to get that too much out of position, otherwise it won't look like the person it's supposed to be. One of the problems with drawing portraits is, finally, it should look rather like the person that you're trying to draw. If you find it doesn't, it probably means you've either got a proportion wrong or you've missed some obvious point. It's usually connected with the eyes and after that the mouth. Those are the two strongest features on the face. Although the nose is a strong feature, it's not so recognizable. The eyes and the mouth are the things we tend to look at most on a human being, and we tend to recognize people by them. I suppose because the eyes obviously attract our attention first, we tend to look at people's eyes first, and then of course when they speak, then the mouth comes into action and we notice that. Position of the ears is important. Now I'm beginning to get the general effect of the whole face. I've now got to be very careful about the sort of details of things like the end of the nose, which if I get right will look like the person. If I don't get right, will detract from the final look. And you'll be able to judge in a minute as to whether this detracts or not. Thing about the eyes is you have to put them in fairly dark because the pupils and the iris are usually reasonably dark, but there's always a bright speck where the light catches the luminous part of the eye. And if you don't put that in, the eyes tend to look a bit dead. Notice how also the upper lid is darker because of the overhang of the eyelid and the eyelashes. It's usually darker than the lower lid. The lower lid is slightly less obvious. Don't allow the whites of the eyes to be too bright because there is a certain amount of shadow over them. The darkest area around the eyes is usually in the corner of the eye alongside the edge of the nose. Then on the nose, the nostril obviously shows up, and the end of the nose is usually fairly well defined against the lightness of the cheek on the other side. Don't make the eyebrows too heavy. They should be strong enough, but don't allow them to become very hefty black marks. Now I can see just a little bit of the hair on the right-hand side of the head around the eyebrow and the brows, and that will give me a nice dark area to throw forward that part of the brow. When you're drawing the hair, don't get too tied up with every hair line. Tend to deal with it as a whole, keep it a generalized effect. The thing about when you put in the ears is that they have to be in the right position. They have to be the right basic shape. You don't have to get too tied up with them because one of the things that people very rarely notice is the ear. So they wouldn't recognize your ear even if they saw it under a microscope. Notice how the darkness of the hair throws forward even the shadowed part of the face. That's a great advantage in your drawing. Now the next bit is the mouth area, which again you have to be fairly careful to get the right shapes here. Don't overdo the shadow, but on the other hand, don't leave anything out. Now you notice the upper lip looks much darker than the lower lip because it's, of course, it's projecting forward, and so the light rarely catches very much of it, just the top edge, really. The central line of the mouth is the most important piece to mark in. It's the strongest line on the mouth, not the edges of the lips. You can let those be a little less definite. Notice the little tucks around the edge of the mouth and the corners of the mouth. That also helps to define the mouth. Now we come to the chin. All you've got to be careful about here is not making it too big or too small. The proportion is noticeable if you get it wrong. And we're almost there. And the last thing is the angle of the jaw and the shadow it makes in between it and the neck. And that again helps to define the whole head. You can strengthen up the shadow a little bit under the chin, down the neck, and then where the neck shows up against the clothing on the shoulders, you need to sort of make sure that also looks. Right, now I'm just sharpening up a little bit round the eyes, because the eye is the most important part, and you need it to be them to be stronger looking than most of the rest of the face, because they're the part of the face that grabs our attention. And there you have it. Now we look at the details of the head, and we'll start with the eye. There are one or two things you need to notice about the shape of the eye. Obviously, the first thing is to get the main shape of the aperture between the two eyelids. Get that a reasonable shape so that it begins to look like an eye shape. But if you notice that the upper eyelid, which is of the two lids, is the thicker and the more obvious, that comes over the iris of the eye slightly, and that allows you to draw the iris so that it takes up quite a lot of the area of the white of the eye, and the bottom of the iris just about touches the bottom lid. It sometimes is off the bottom lid, but usually it's around about just touching the bottom lid. Notice that the thickness of the bottom lid you can put in, because the light usually catches it. The line of the eyelashes on the upper lid can be quite strong and dark because of the overhang of the upper lid and the thickness of the eyelashes on that part. The pupil is obviously central to the iris, and notice there's always a little glint where the light catches the eyes. So although most of the pupil is relatively dark and the iris is relatively dark, there's always this point where the light catches on the edge of the pupil and the iris itself. Make the pupil as dark as you like, be quite black. Make the top part of the upper lid a bit stronger. Put a little bit of shadow on the inside corner of the eye, and don't forget that the lower lid, although it doesn't stand out much, there is a certain amount of eyelash along that lid, and also it does project slightly away from the cheek. Mark in the eyebrow just to give you a relationship of the brow to the eye itself. You can put some shadow in round the corner of the eye where it's in close to the nose. It helps to define that part of the eye, and that gives you the general shape of the eye. When we come to the mouth, one of the things to notice is that the strongest line of the mouth is the place where the two lips meet. Quite often beginners, when they draw the mouth, they emphasize the edge of the lips, the outside edge of the lips. This is less prominent than you might think, and you've only got to study it for a short time to realize that the strongest line is always the place where the mouth opens. That's where you've got actually two edges coming together. If you make the outside edge of the lip too strong, it starts to look as though they've got very hefty lipstick on, which tends to flatten out the mouth against the rest of the face. Notice the little tucks in the corner of the mouth. And the lower lip will have more light on it than the upper lip. So you can put the upper lip in quite a lot of shadow, but the lower lip you leave as light as you possibly can. It does have a little bit of shadow over it, and particularly under the bottom edge in the centre of the mouth, you can put a little bit of shadow because it helps to define the way the lip juts out away from the chin a bit. As you can see, the main line is that central line, not so much the edges of the lips. I'll just darken it up a little bit more on this side, and that gives you the mouth. Now we look at the proportions of the full human body. I've taken a masculine figure here. First of all, you notice that taking a dividing line down the centre, it's basically the same on both sides of that dividing line. So you don't have to worry too much about differences between them. Then, if you take the length of the figure and you take the length of the head from the top of the crown of the head to the chin as one unit, that divides into the full length of the human figure round about 7.5 times. Classically, the heroic proportions were 1 to 8, so the head would fit into the classic proportion 8 times, and that does give a grander looking figure. But generally speaking, most people actually, the proportion is about 7.5 times, give or take a bit. Notice that the second division comes across where the nipples of the chest are. The third division is around about the point of the navel, and the halfway mark is where the legs join the torso in the pubic area. The lower part are less obvious. There's a division above the knee, the middle of the calf, and down near the ankle. If you don't have a live model when you're drawing a human figure, don't worry too much. Work from photographs as I'm doing here. It's better to work from a live model, of course, but it's quite a good way of practicing to work from photographs. Here I've got a man sitting in a sort of huddled up shape. So what I look here for is the main shape of the whole thing. I block in the whole shape. The position he's sitting in, the curve of the back going up, the arm coming across to the knees, the lower part of the leg and the legs bent up. So I've got a shape, very simple shape that everything is going to more or less fit in. The feet project slightly, the head projects slightly, but everything else fits into this very solid shape, and it's much easier if you can block in a shape like this. It makes it much easier then to work up the details afterwards. If it's a particular shape where the figure is still and not moving, it's much the easiest way to draw the human figure. When drawing the human figure, especially if it's in movement, the idea is to try and get something down that suggests the movement of the figure. For example, this walking girl, she's striding out, head slightly forward, the torso does a curve, something like that, and then the front leg pushes forward like that, whereas the back one does that sort of thing. She's got one arm swinging back on this side and the other arm swinging forward on the other. Now that is a sort of stickman version of a human being, but you need to bulk out the sort of the area of the head and get some effect of the shape of the body in there around this movement. Thighs, calves, etc., feet. At this speed of drawing, you don't have to worry about detail at all, but it's a good idea to get some idea of the proportional shapes of the limbs against the main body. Now that we've practiced these exercises, you should now have some skills to go out and confidently have a go at drawing the world that you see. Don't forget to practice. The more you practice, the better. And don't be afraid of making mistakes. Above all, enjoy yourself. Once you move out into the open air, so to speak, or you're drawing large objects such as furniture or cars or things like that, you have to take into account perspective. Now, this is just an exercise to give yourself some idea of how it works. It's a very simple exercise, and it gives you an idea of how two-point perspective works, which most perspective in drawing is two-point perspective. First of all, you draw a faint line, which is your horizon line. Now, against that, you place a perpendicular line, which is going to be the nearest point of your object, which is going to be a sort of building or something like that, a large block of something. Having got a top to it and a bottom, you are then going to join that with the horizon line at what are called the vanishing points. And they're called vanishing points because when you look along a three-dimensional object, it appears that if you drew a straight line from them, they would disappear into a point on the horizon at some point. Now, this is how you can construct a very simple three-dimensional object in space, which will look as though it is standing in space with space behind it as well as in front of it. And so you've just joined the two ends of that vertical line to two vanishing points on the horizon, like that. Now, obviously, this block is going to have an end, so we'll take it that this side of the block is the shorter side of the block, and you give it an end there, and this side of the block is a slightly longer side of the block, and you can give it an end there. Now, what you've got now is a block of something, which I will sharpen up to make it more obvious, which could be a building or a large chunk of stone or something like that. And by sharpening up the lines, you can see how they will begin to look like a solid shape against a spacious background. So I've sharpened up those sides of this apparent cuboid shape, and I will also strengthen the line of the horizon now, but only where it doesn't cut across the object. So what you now see is a three-dimensional block in front of a very large open space, and it's got space in front of it and space apparently behind it. It's a trick, and it's a useful trick because it helps artists to define a shape in space very easily. Perspective gets more complicated than this. You can go into great detail in it later on, but just draw up this thing just to get some idea of how it works. There's another kind of perspective which is called aerial perspective, and this diagram or drawing that I've got here is of a highly simplified landscape which shows to a certain extent how this works. If you look at the drawing of the mountains in the background or the hills in the background, they're very faintly drawn. There's a soft, sort of hardly drawn edge to them. There's no detail, there's no tone on them. They're almost the same colour as the sky. Then you look at the middle ground, which are the hills just in front of that, and the part where the tree in the foreground is growing. The tree is growing up out of this middle ground area, and you'll notice that the texture of the tree is slightly fuller, slightly more dense than the texture of the mountains and hills behind it. Then you come right into the foreground where you have a large bush on the right-hand side and a whole row of grasses and plants in the front edge of the picture, so to speak. And all this is in strong definition, darkly drawn, lots of texture, lots of bits and pieces. The drawing is beefed up in such a way that it looks stronger and more powerful. And that's because it's right close to you. It's the nearest thing, and you would be able to see a lot of detail and a lot of texture. Aerial perspective means that the closer the things are, you see more texture, more detail. The further away things are, you see less texture and less detail. In a decent landscape of any size, you've got to have a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. When you're looking at landscape, you sometimes don't want all of the landscape. So it's quite useful to have a little device like this, which you've got a cut-out area, and you can hold that up in front of the landscape and blot out certain parts of it and just concentrate on the central part. So you can choose your landscape rather more specifically with the use of a frame like this.